There was a cataclysmic change that happened in the city of Chicago on Wednesday of this week. A mayoral election, a runoff involving more than 7 candidates. And for the first time since the 1980s, an incumbent mayor of the city of Chicago lost and will not repeat for a second term. I mean, cataclysmic. The mayor, Lori Lightfoot, won 50 of 50 wards when she was elected 4 years ago. And on Wednesday of this week, she received 17% of the popular vote. All of this unhappiness, and it's clear to say it is unhappiness, is predicated on what's happened to Chicago. Now, of course, we're so far away from the city of Chicago and not deeply connected to what's happening there. But I'll tell you this. It's a mess. Mm-hmm. Homicides are through the roof. Lawlessness is just running rampant. And it's because of this administration, the Lori Lightfoot administration, has essentially taken the teeth out of law enforcement. Here to talk to us about that, about what it is to be in law enforcement and the importance of this. Say what you will, right? And there's a lot of conversation about this, is J. Warner Wallace. Jim has been a guest on our show over the many years. J. Warner Wallace is a Dateline featured cold case detective, an author, a speaker, a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and adjunct professor of apologetics at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. His newest book is called Person of Interest: Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. Jim, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This is actually, I'm busy writing the next book, and I thought I just can't break away to do anything else. But when you told me what we were going to be talking about, I thought, okay, and we're going to have to make the exception because this is such a growing concern, right, about what's happening nationally related to law enforcement.
Yeah. All right, Jim. So the stat that I absolutely was shocked by is that the homicide rate in Chicago is 5 times that of New York City. To imagine such a deceleration in just, being able to live normal life in that city is really shocking. From your perspective, you hear those rates. What do you think?
Well, it's not just in Chicago. I hate to say it. This is happening nationwide, especially in large urban areas. And there's a reason for this. Look, I often say this, and I'm never popular when I say it. I used to say it a lot when I was training my own officers at our agency in Los Angeles County, and my mayor and city council did not like it when I would say it. But law enforcement is the one necessary profession upon which every other profession is contingent. Now, I know that sounds a little bit arrogant to say in a world really since COVID, where we've said there's so many essential services, right? And of course, these services are important. There are many essential services, but none is more essential than law enforcement. Remember, we used to have volunteer firemen, and you could back in the Wild West, you had one paid employee first. That was your sheriff. Why? Because you can't really run a medical practice if you're afraid that someone's going to rob you at the end of treatment. You have to have order first. This is why, for example, it's so critical that law enforcement officers be upstanding, because they stand as the foundation for modern civilization. Right. And so I know I get this. People will say, well, those other things are more important. Like, I have a doctor for a son, and I have a police officer for a son. But there is no doubting that one of these is contingent upon the other. And this is what we have to realize, that if we are going to treat law enforcement like it's just another thing we can replace with some other body of servants, good luck with that. And what I see happening is that we have started to kind of move away from nobody wants to be a police officer anymore. Our agency is probably down by about 30% right now. Wow. I don't think that's much different than other agencies around the country.
Okay, so Jim, the narrative is, right, and of course you know this very well, probably more than anybody, is we're going to defund the police because essentially the police are a bunch of rogues and they're out there murdering people in the streets. And so we'll take away their teeth and replace them with mental health workers who will engage those who are involved and seal the problem, or at least help heal the problem by looking at people's hearts and minds first.
I like to say it kind of this way. Law enforcement is like a 10th domino service. It's not a first domino service. I mean, I also agree that there are lots of reasons why particular groups are where they are right now based on the history of our country, how certain groups have been treated. I get all that. That's a first domino issue. But you don't hire us to handle the first domino. I really don't have, I feel the same way you do about the number of dominoes that fell before we got to what we call today. But now you're hiring a body of people to serve you today. And we have to, what do you do when you've got true crime is occurring And at that point, you cannot reasonably expect to go back to the first domino. You're in the moment of the 10th domino, and you need servants who are equipped to handle the 10th domino. And I get it. Whatever we do now in order to right the ship, I hope will have a consequence on 20 years from now. But what do we do today in Chicago? Not what we hope to create for 20 years from now in Chicago. That's the real question.
We're talking to J. Werner Wallace. He's an author and a speaker, presenter, and a former police officer. You mentioned that you have a son who's a doctor. You have a son who's a cop. And you were one yourself. You're the son of a cop. So this is in your blood. When you come to grips with a lot of the issues that get publicity as far as policemen who have just outright killed people, policemen who are racially biased. Talk about how you see, where you see those in the dominoes and how you communicate with people who look at you and say, you're a cop, you're white, we can't and we can't have any relationship.
No, I totally get it. No one hates misbehavior on the part of police officers than police officers who don't misbehave. And we have a zero tolerance ourselves. We're looking at a police force of anywhere between 800 to 1,000 to 1 million officers. It's hard to kind of judge this as they want to keep good records on this. But that's a large body of people. From the number of people you see misbehaving when you see this in the news. And so I think that we have to keep this in perspective. Look, nobody wants to. We have a high bar, but there's no way to. If you pass the physical skill and you pass our background check and you pass. The bar's pretty high, but you can see places though, like cities like Memphis, for example, where they're trying to develop a direct path for parolees to make it onto the law enforcement team. You have to think about that we cannot lower the standards. We have to continue to raise the standard. And I'm in favor of raising the standards. But the question I would have is what kinds of questions could we ask in an oral board that would determine if you're fit for this job? Most of the questions you and I would say are important questions to ask, we probably aren't going to be able to ask because they violate certain rights of the person you're asking the question to. I want to ask questions like, what's the last thing you did that it wasn't all about you? You say you want to serve your community. Show me your history of serving your community to this point. Like, what is it I coach my son's soccer team. Well, that's for you, bud. That's your son on the soccer team. When's the last time you did something when there was nothing in it for you? That's true service. And I don't think we only ask those kinds of questions on the oral boards. We ask, that's part of the problem. And it turns out we often will go to a strategy to hire officers. I used to tell my chief, look, you want to hire officers, start looking at the Christian universities and colleges where young men and women are looking for something they feel called to by God to do as a matter of holy duty. The problem is we're in a culture that's moved away from this notion. They would much rather advertise by saying, hey, you got great days off. We can pay you really well. It's fun. Is that what you want to hire? I want to hire somebody who's willing to do this for free because they feel called to do it by God. That group, though, is shrinking. So we're going to have a harder time hiring those kinds of people. Look, here's the tug of war that occurs in every officer's mind. We signed up and we're willing to give our life to defend our community. At the same time, we'd like to go home at the end of the shift.
Yes.
That tug of war between what we feel called to do and what we really yearn to do is the tug of war of every officer. There are fewer people who are willing to do that for our community, especially if every step along the way, you're in jeopardy of either losing your life on the job, like being shot. Like just yesterday, an officer was killed in Chicago.
Yes.
In a domestic violence case where he was just running after the offender and shots were fired in both directions, he succumbed to his injuries. This is happening. Who wants to do this? If he just survived that shooting, would he have been sued by some group for having shot his weapon? This is happening there are a number of district attorneys that are now in place in urban areas that are really not in favor of supporting the actions of police. They would assume them guilty before they assume them doing their duty. Right. And I think when people see that, they're like, why would I sign up for this? Look, folks, we don't just, firemen don't ride around looking for a potential fire. They respond after you call them for a fire. If you want police officers to actually act proactively, patrol, we have a patrol function. There's no patrol function in any other service. We patrol around. You're hoping our very presence will deter crime. And that is typically where officers will get into trouble because, if they stop you for something, why are you stopping me? Well, because you've hired us to do something proactively to make sure our community is safe. What do you want us to do? I think what's going to happen now is you're going to see that police officers are going to become more and more reactive. Just call us if you got a problem. We'll get there and take the report. I suspect that patrol divisions are going to shrink and detective investigative divisions are going to grow.
Interesting.
Because no one's going to try to stop crime before it occurs. We're just going to respond afterwards and give the case to a detective.
Right. Okay, Jim, so you paint, I would say, a very dire picture about the forward motion of the ability for police to police. The good news is that, this defund the police initiative, which has given rise in the last couple of years, by looking at Chicago and the mayor's complete and abysmal failure to be reelected, there's a wake-up call that's going on here. Now, the problem is, as you've very succinctly pointed out, the pool has shrunk. Good and well-meaning people do not want to be part of this because of any number of really difficult issues. So is there a solution? I mean, how do those things work together? People's eyes have opened up. We want to live in a free and safe society, but now we've pushed away all the good applicants.
Well, I'll be honest with you. The people whose neighborhoods are in most need of protection are in favor of police officers. What you'll see is it's usually the people who don't think they have a need for police officers will make decisions about police officers. But the communities that we actually police, they understand. The law-abiding citizens in communities in which crime is occurring do not want you to reduce the number of police officers that are in their communities. I mean, that kind of poll work has been done for years. In Los Angeles County, for example, it's typically the voters that live in areas that don't have high crime, that think they know what they want to do with the police. The people who are in the high crime areas actually, I think, are in favor of the presence of police. Now, look, before we start here, remember, we're thinking about all of this in terms of police who are doing their duty and are not committing crimes. Look, we're all opposed to those kinds of people. We want to find them. There should be no second chances. They should be absolutely eliminated from the profession. There's no question about that. The question is, once you've got someone who's called to do this job, do you want us to do it? Yeah. Also, remember that we don't have a duty. We have a right to protect our own lives. And so sometimes people will say, well, why did you shoot before he shot at you? Because if I wait, am I supposed to take a round first? What if the round's a headshot? I mean, do I have a right to stop my own death a millisecond before it occurs?
Milliseconds.
And that's the problem, is that this is a very risky business, and you're not really no one's being paid very well, and what we are being paid for is risk. And it's just becoming riskier and riskier, and they aren't increasing the pay. So the problem is, how do you hire people to do this risky job? It's not just physically risky. It is, there's a lot of lawsuits and all those kinds of things too. And so the question becomes, why would anybody want this?
J. Werner Wallace is with us. His latest book is called Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. Our time's almost up, Jim, but we've lost 2 police officers in the Pittsburgh area in the last 2 months, something like that. And, in watching all of the things that happened after their death and the outpouring of love from the community and the care and concern that's been extended to their family and all of that, it made me think we're not dead inside. You know what I mean? As people, like we know that is a place of honor to be a police officer.
And the sacrifice.
And the sacrifice of it is evident to everybody. And so we all mourn for that. It just saddens me so much that we're not able to take the purity of that devotion and understanding and put it in place before someone's killed in a day-to-day basis. And that type of trust is what's broken down, and that type of communication doesn't happen. Do you have any ideas, tips? Like, what do you suggest to people who really want there to be that type of deep compassion and understanding one for another before an incident occurs?
Well, two things. For officers, like we were invested. My son and I were invested in this process. I'm just going to do a shameless plug. We started a ministry a couple of years ago. It's called the Thin Blue Life, and it's at thethinbluelife.com. It's really helping officers kind of navigate this profession from a Christian worldview. But what I can say to people who aren't police officers, if you have a reverence for what police officers do, what good police officers contribute to culture, then I don't typically get involved in politics, but I think it's fair for us to vote what is important to us. And it turns out that's what happened in Chicago. At some point, people realize, no, you know what, you can swing that pendulum out as far as you want to swing it, but reality of it is we need these guys and gals. So we're going to start to vote on our priorities. And I think if we do that, we're going to be fine. I'm not as concerned as the pendulum swings. Here's what I would say. The pendulum is swinging, but my concern is that the base upon which the pendulum is swinging is starting to lean in one direction. So it always swings out a little further than it used to. It doesn't quite swing back as far as it used to. What we have to do by voting is simply to right the balance. We're not trying to lean it in the other direction. We just want to get it back level again.
Amen. Jim, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for your time here with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Always good to hear from you, Jim. Take care.
Good to see you both.
Thank you.
Bye.
J. Werner Wallace, Cold Case Detective. You can find him very easily online at his Cold Case Detective online. His latest book is called Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. J. Werner Wallace.